The BC First Responder Resiliency Program, or sometimes Loon Lake. What a name to be saddled with, right? Loon Lake. But even though I'll be talking about the program that we've been developing, primarily with BC firefighters, I don't want you to take away, if you're looking for a nugget, I don't want you to just think about it as a program. Your nugget is knowledge that there's a program out there. Because although the work that we've been doing and the evaluation of the program has been about a proof of concept, of seeing what we can do, I'd like you to look at it as also a proof of possibility. What is possible? When we take what people like me bring, the neuroscience, the psychology, trying to understand what the best practice is, and we combine that with what you bring to the table. Your courage, your willingness to do hard work, your ability to dig deep, your willingness and your ability to have a sense of family where you have each other's back, particularly in the most difficult times and the difficult work. And this is difficult work. And so when you bring that, what is possible? What can you do? And so I hope that you'll look at the data as your data. 110 people have gone through the program so far, mostly firefighters, but also police, paramedics, search and rescue, and Coast Guard. The data that I present is not my data, it's theirs. The first 61 have reached 6 months out, and so we have the outcome data that I'll show you. They worked really hard for these outcomes. They dug deep. Now this story begins about 2.5 years ago when I got a phone call. A friend of mine, a firefighter, Tony Speece, we'd got to know each other, we'd worked quite extensively together on a veterans program. Tony was a veteran, trying to figure out supports to not just allow veterans to come home, but also to finally fully come home, to feel at home. And so he phoned me, even though we'd moved on from that program, he would contact me once or twice a year and he'd have a friend. And he'd say, Duncan, I got this guy. And he's totally switched on, but he's struggling. He's suicidal. I need you to see him. And I go, okay. And this happened a number of times. And in this particular conversation, it was a short conversation, but we were both saying, you know, why do we have to wait until the problems are chronic? And why do we have to wait until something's gone to a crisis before somebody comes into my office? It's too late. Now we got two problems for the price of one because the damage has expanded. Why can't we get in earlier? Why can't we get in upstream and do something different? And so we thought, well, we could create a program. And so that's where it began. And it began with Tony's invitation and a bunch of introductions to some fine folk at the BC Professional Firefighters Association, and we started to build it. Somewhere there's a clicker, which I should probably use. The first step in building a program is, of course, not to build it in isolation, but to start to understand the problem, start to understand the barriers. What can we do? What are the opportunities that exist? And so we sat down, and with my colleague, Diana Vissers, we sat down and we interviewed 30 firefighters. We had 70 hours of interview on tape to try and understand what is the experience? Why did you join? What motivated you in the very, very beginning? What were your first experiences like? What was your first call like? What was the first call that stuck? And who within your organization did you look to to model what was culturally appropriate in terms of dealing with it? And we took that information, we asked them questions like, if you could go back to yourself as a recruit, as a probationer, what advice would you give yourself then? And we had some really rich interviews. And based on that, a concept started to emerge so that I could understand your work and see if this plays out for you, see if this resonates. And tell me if it doesn't, because that's the only way that I'll get closer. But it's this idea that civilian society exists within this kind of bubble, a protected bubble of relative safety and security. And that as civilians, we're protected from the chaos, the danger, the worst of what happens to human beings, the worst of what we do to each other or to ourselves, the fragility of life, by a group of individuals. You like my artwork? And those individuals are often, not always, but they're often in uniform of different colors. And people emerge from the civilian world and they move into these first responder roles, these protective roles. And it's like civilian society has outsourced its trauma to you, and you play that role. But of course, that makes your everyday very different than my everyday. There is a firefighter saying, right, that your worst day is our everyday. And that's true probably for most first responders. And so what is normal for me on my daily basis is very different for you. And that makes you different. I live in a world of safety and security because of what you do, but not just what you do, but who you are. But this also makes you different. It makes you different than the high school friends that you left behind who might just kind of beg you, come on, tell me a story, tell me what you've seen. And finally you relent and you start to tell the story, and they go green, and they don't like story time so much anymore. Right? And so you become a little bit alienated from the people who aren't outside of that bubble with you. You don't have the same things in common. But you find when you go home, you might face the same problem, that your spouse and your kids, they might be losing their stuff over the temperature of the coffee at Starbucks or the fact that they don't have the newest iPhone, and you're thinking, do you know what I've seen today? You're so lucky to have these first world problems, right? And so it makes you different, and so it can alienate you from yourself. But there's another cost, because as you go out to the surface of that bubble as a recruiter, as a probationer, of course, you're going to be looked at very carefully. You're under scrutiny. Do you have what it takes? Are you tough enough? Can you suck it up and do what needs to be done? Can you suppress all of the personal feelings that might get in the way, that might make you backpedal? Your fear, your anxiety, your disgust, whatever it might be that might interfere with getting the job done. And so you learn as a probationer or a recruit to look around to see what's okay, how are you allowed to express yourself? And you suppress the emotions that might show that you're impacted and you might not be strong enough for that job, and you learn to do that. And by the time you're on the job 2 or 3 years, it's so ingrained that you look at the new probationers and the new recruits and you go, well, why can't they? What's wrong with them? I did it. And so you perpetuate the culture, a culture of stoicism. And the funny thing is that that's also, I understand how that also works, because the characteristics that you choose, that you want in the person going through the door to whatever the call is, whether it's a fire or a firefight or incredible injuries that you have to face. You want somebody that can suck it up and do what needs to be done. You want somebody who's stoic. You want somebody who's a team player, who can self-sacrifice, who can put their own issues aside for the moment. Those all serve the call. But the problem is that they don't necessarily serve you after the call, when you go back to the hall or the depot or wherever you might go. Because the practice of sucking it up and not talking about your experience so that nobody will question your fitness also means that you won't share your story, and it robs you of the opportunity to discover, as we're discovering now, that there's a shared experience, that there's a community of experience of impact of service. And when you don't share your story, you also inadvertently continue the myth of unaffected service, that nobody is affected. And so when you identify impact, because you will, because you're a mammal, because we've got a little fail-safe in there, and if you get enough of a dosage of trauma, it'll switch over so that you're continually on and you don't come down. It's part of why we, as soft-skinned, blunt-toothed, short-nailed mammals have survived, is because we're so good at adapting to danger. So if we outsource it so that you get extra, what's going to happen? You're at danger. But when you discover it, because it doesn't fit with the culture, it comes out as things like this. There had always been a stigma around this throughout my life and career. It was hard for me to reconcile that who I thought was a strong man had these problems and needed the help of someone else. Hard to reconcile that strength and struggle, these are two things, it's binary, that these don't fit together. Now, as a trauma therapist for 23 years, I'll tell you, in my experience, is that struggle in life, the darkest times in our life are very often, that's the crucible of character. It's where people discover their strength, their capacity, their endurance, and they also discover who's got their back. And very often people will say things like, I would never wish what happened to me on anybody, but because it happened, I know what is most important to me, and I value it. Is post-traumatic growth. But what happens with the culture is things like this. At my work, psychologist is a dirty word. Nobody wants to see the psychologist. Like if you see the psychologist, then you're weak, you're broken. And so while clinicians like me have terms, clinical depression, PTSD, you hear that through your own filter. Weak, broken, a fall from grace. A reason for shame, for stigma, and for silence. You don't share that stuff. And so we thought, could we do something different? And people like Tony taught me that there's another way, that courage is an antidote. Now, Tony had lots of courage. He had courage in the battlefield as a veteran. When they were ambushed in the Medak pocket in Yugoslavia, he was decorated for his actions that contributed to saving his troop. But when he came home, he had to display another kind of courage or find another kind of courage because there was another battle waiting for him when he came home, a battle for his own heart and mind and soul, to make sense of what he'd seen, what he'd had to do, and what he and the rest of us collectively had failed to stop from happening there. But rather than going and licking his wounds in the corner and hiding it, he stood up with his chin high, his head held high, and said, help me. He claimed his experience and he said, help me understand what I'm going through and help me understand what to do about it. And then when he'd done his own work, he used that to have empathy, to look inside and say, you, I recognize you're struggling. And to use courage to stand with his colleagues who needed him and at times to drag them to safety. And although his first courage on the battlefield saved lives, it was the second courage and the third courage, the courage to stand and own his own experience, and the courage to stand with his peers when they were struggling most, that has actually saved far more lives. Do we value it less? And so the idea of this program was to create a venue where that kind of courage could emerge. And my time is clicking by, so we needed a retreat. We needed a time away from your life to recalibrate, to think. We needed it to be with peers. We needed people like me, but we needed people like you to lead it, to co-design it and co-lead it. We followed a trajectory, creating a safe zone, because we can do more if we're in a cohesive team. If you've ever played sports on a cohesive team, you know that cohesion helps performance, and resilience is a kind of performance. Versus a fractured team, how do you come back? And then we do the work, the hard work that calls upon your courage and your fortitude and your willingness, but also your loyal to each other to stand beside each other. But with a purpose, you unpack strategically to repack and carry things forward in a different way, but to also accumulate tools, the best of what we can find from the evidence, and to think about, because it's not 4 days in the woods, it's about what you do with that 4 days. And if it doesn't transfer into your life after that, if you can't move out with strategic goal setting and plans, then it's just 4 days, and we should have gone fishing. Would have been more fun, that's for sure. We try and bring down all of the evidence that we have to talk about the brain, what's happening in the neuroscience, what's happening, what can we do, what are the cognitive behavioral tools about our narrative centers and the way that they regulate the levels of the brain, and how do we talk to ourselves the way we would talk to somebody we actually care about. You can imagine that. The breath, we've heard a lot about how the breath accesses. It's a back door to our parasympathetic system. The body, what we can do when we focus out of here and into the world, our behavior, what conditions can we set? And the final one, our bonds. Who stands with us, beside us? And I'd go into these, but that's a whole other lecture. But trying to make it deployable, understandable, memorable, relevant, and maybe even palatable. And so we tested it before and after. And this is a small pilot study. The first 61 people have gone through. We wanted to know, are we having any effect? Is it durable? And most important of all, are we doing any damage? And what we found is that people were coming in depressed, clinical levels, hopeless, helpless, no longer able to enjoy the things that had given them pleasure before. At 2 weeks post, it had dropped out of the clinical zone. And at 6 months, it had maintained a fair stability, a slight uptick, but non-significant. We had statistically significant and clinically significant results. Cohen's d is a description of the size of it as expressed as a standard deviation, so 0.88 of a standard deviation at 6 months. We looked at post-traumatic stress. People coming in the clinical zone 2 weeks later dropping out. This is not the same as diagnosis. It's a screening test. That's what it is. At 6 months, it had continued to improve. These are the test scores, but when you look at the actual percentage who were screening positive for PTSD, 50% were coming in the door, and this is supposed to be an upstream program. By 2 weeks afterwards, 25%. By 6 months, it had dropped to 15%. Now, I don't need to tell you, it's not the program, it's something that's happening there. It's a beginning, but something's happening once they go out the door. The last measure we used, the OQ45, is a common measure for clinical practice, measures things like interpersonal relations, your social role, your quality of life. And again, we saw this drop out of a clinical zone, clinically significant, statistically significant results, and this huge effect, size of the effect of over 1 standard deviation. So how is this happening? And the numbers capture part of the story, but the comments and feedback collected by the BC Professional Firefighters Association capture some of the other parts of it. It took hope to show up at a program like this, and it took courage to fully participate. I arrived broken, anxious, and feeling alone. I left empowered, more at peace, and with what I anticipate will be a lifelong bond with 9 new peers that is unlike anything I have ever experienced. This is what you brought. I'm no longer in a downward spiral of isolation and depression. I have a light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm, for the first time in a very long time, hopeful for a bright future. The program literally saved my life. Just 2 weeks prior, I was seriously considering suicide, the 3rd time of late, complete with a plan. What are we doing? It's 4 days in the woods. It's not about a program. It's about something that the program may be facilitating, but it's something that you brought. It's something you brought. It wasn't about 4 days. This is about changing our lives. And finally, we were challenged to build a team that could trust each other in sharing raw pain, so much so that we would have each other's back at all times. And I think there, in that last piece, is something that's very important. Who are you in your organization? Who are you? Are you like the all-star on the team who's so damn good everybody compares themselves to you and feels a little bit bad in comparison because they're not as good? Or are you like the team captain? Are you like the person who's the glue in the team, who through their very presence elevates the game of everybody on the team? Who are you? And who could you be? It'll take courage to speak out, to own your experience, to come forward, to say, this is my experience, to own it, and also have each other's back. But look at the possibility here. 4 days in the woods didn't do this. You did this. These were your results. You worked hard for them. You worked hard for them. So what will you create? Because the future of your organizations, no matter what your sphere of influence, whether it's just a partnership or it's a team, it's a crew, or whether you're in charge of an entire organization, what's your sphere of influence? And who will you be as a leader? Because leadership is not about position. It's about stepping from one place and taking a stand, to step forward into a new way of being, to take care of yourself and to take care of each other different. And to mobilize the very strengths that you bring, your courage, your fortitude, your willingness to do hard work, your willingness to stand together, not only with the stories that are fun to tell or that you're proud to tell, but to stand shoulder to shoulder with each other with the stories that you can barely get out. The stories that you'd rather forget but cannot. Can you use your family, your first responder family, to stand together in that way so that you're not just creating a stoic organization and a stoic service culture that's also brittle, but you're creating organizations and teams and partnerships, peer relationships that are strong, that are compassionate, that are a place for your courage to come forward, your loyalty, that are resilient relationships, a resilient culture. So thank you very much.